I do not like this book. It doesn't mean it's not a good book. It doesn't mean that I'm not glad that I read it. I am. It actually was a bad way to put it. I do like how good the book is. But I am uncomfortable with learning even more deeply how deep the race divide is and what in the world to do about it. So this book is not an easy book. The author, Richard Hughes, is a man that I knew at one time in an earlier chapter of my life. He's a historian that was connected to the Churches of Christ. He was a very fine historian, and I've read other books by him and books co-authored by him. And I'm a fan of his, and he is a legitimately respected historian. What I mean to say by that is, he does his homework, and there's really not much dispute about what he writes. His footnotes are extensive, and his quotings of people from the past are just immense. And this is good, solid history writing. Okay, my first introduction is about the trip that my wife and I just took to Memphis. The last few years we've been to Atlanta, Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery, Little Rock, and now Memphis, going to where the civil rights sites are. And in Memphis, we went to the Mason Temple, which is the headquarters of the Church of God in Christ. But on April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech called "I've Been to the Mountaintop" in that room. And he died the next day on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. We went to the Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel, but it's not really a tourist site. But I knew about this place and I wanted to go see it. If you want to see pictures, I've got them. But we went to see the auditorium, the large auditorium, where Dr. King gave his last speech the night before he died. Is there anybody in the room who's been to Memphis and you've been to the Pink Palace? Okay. We did the normal tourist things. In case you're not aware, there has been no good music in America since Elvis Presley. So we did a serious Elvis Presley tour. But we went into the Pink Palace. The first ever self-service grocery store where you walk in and get the stuff off the shelf yourself was the Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee. And there is a reproduction, exact size, within this enormous mansion of the original Piggly Wiggly. You walk in through a turnstile, you go up and down aisles, and you pay on the way out. The mansion was being built by a man named Saunders, who owned the Piggly Wiggly, and he went bankrupt in the 1929 stock crash. And so he couldn't finish the mansion. And he gave it to the city of Memphis. And so I'm reading from the placard at the entrance called Biography of a Mansion. When developers bought the estate at auction, they planned to turn the land into an expensive and fashionable suburb, and the palace came along with the lot. The new owners deeded the building to the city of Memphis in 1926, and we actually went bankrupt before the 29 crash, stipulating that it become, quote, a conservatory, art gallery, museum of art or natural history, used wholly and exclusively for public uses for the benefit of persons of the Caucasian race. Now, number one, that's not a surprise. And number two, that's just a public building with museums and displays that African Americans could not go to. They finally could in the mid-60s when the laws changed. Okay, that's introduction number one. Introduction number two. Take your hand out and look at the back. And this will mean nothing to anybody, but I'm going to tell you the story. At the bottom it says the African American voices. And everybody in this list is someone that he quoted from or visited with or interviewed in preparation of this book. So I want you to circle a name on the 5th line down on the far right, and the name is Hubert G. Locke. Circle the name Hubert Locke. And I'm going to tell you a story. I read the name of the book and I just started laughing, and I went and told my wife. In 1973, I was 22 years old. Abilene, I was a minister in the Church of Christ. I was a youth minister. And Abilene Christian College, now Abilene Christian University, had an event called the Preachers Forum. And it was something they'd never done before. They had 2 different preachers debate each other on an issue. So they did, should you drink alcohol? Should you accept divorced people? They had a session on racism. And one of the speakers was Hubert Locke, an African-American minister from Detroit. This Hubert Locke. And somewhere in passing, he mentioned that his church had dances for their teenagers. Now, I got to try to figure out how to tell you this. Dancing in a Church of Christ in 1973 was a shocking comment. And so in the question and answer session afterwards, some minister from Texas raised his hand and said, Mr. Locke, I don't think he even called me Brother Locke. Everybody else was brother. He said, Mr. Locke, are you implying that there's nothing sinful about the modern dance? And Hubert Locke said, sinful? The modern dance? Lordy no. And I think that was the day that Abilene Christian burned to the ground. That is a true story, and I have never forgotten it, and I hadn't thought about Hubert Locke for, 40 years. So that's been fun. Okay. Now, I think we need to do for this book, turn to the inside back page. The name of the book is Myths America Lives By. Myths America Lives By. White Supremacy and the Stories That Give Us Meaning. And I had to decide exactly how to do this synopsis. And so what I'm going to do is I'll just read the first portion of this page and we'll talk about it a bit. In the box, I try to summarize what I think the book is saying. We, white people, and yes, in many instances, black people, have fully bought into the myth of white supremacy for all of our history. And it is time to acknowledge it, expose it, condemn it, and get rid of it. So, I think that's what the book is saying. And I like what he does at the beginning of the book, was what is a myth? If you ask the average person, what's a myth? Here is the answer. It's a story that isn't true. I teach my students in rhetoric about mythos, and I have written my own definition, and here's my definition, and then I'm going to tell you his definition. My definition of mythos and myth is that a myth is a story that is true, whether it's true or not. And so, Star Wars is a myth. It's a story that's true, even though there may not have been an actual Princess Leia and, Han Solo. The Wizard of Oz is a myth. There's a great book by Joseph Campbell called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. There was a great series about his work on PBS. And all of that is true. So a myth is a story that you build your life around, that has truth in it that you begin to follow. And so, what is a myth from this book? The Greek word mythos, which literally means story, his definition is a myth is a story that, whether true or false, helps us discern the meaning and purpose of our lives, and for that reason speaks truth to those who embrace it. His is longer and more detailed than mine. And so he quotes somebody that says, we need a story to see in the dark. And without a story, we cannot live. Without a story, we cannot have community. Without a story, life makes no sense. Stories are the imaginative way of ordering our experience. And so I want you to write a sentence down right above this. And it is a sentence from April 3rd, 1968, in the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech, the night before he died, the last speech Dr. King gave, and here is the sentence. All we're saying to America is that you be true to what you say on paper. All we're saying to America is that you be true to what you say on paper. That's the American myth. That this is the land where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that is quoted multiple times in this book. And then it is demonstrated that we haven't lived up to it. So Dr. King said, live up to the story, live up to the myth. It is a story that isn't true, but it should be true. So that's the idea of mythos. Now, I'm going to read you the next section, and this book actually had a first edition, and it did not have white supremacy in the subtitle, and it did not have a chapter on white supremacy. And so these were the 5 chapters in the first edition. They're still in this book, but these were the only 5 sections in the first edition. Here are the 5 myths. The myth of the chosen nation. And I don't know if I've ever said this. When you see something in italics, even in this section of the handout, it's a direct excerpt from the book. So, this is from the book. The myth of the chosen nation. The notion that God Almighty chose the United States for a special mission in the world. Next, the myth of nature's nation. The conviction that American ideals and institutions are rooted in the natural order. That is, in God's own intentions, first revealed at the dawn of creation. And so the idea is that nature itself says America is the chosen nation. That's the idea. The third myth, the myth of the millennial nation. The notion that the United States, building on that natural order, will usher in a final golden age for all humankind. Now, let me pause here a minute. Is there anybody in the room who recognizes these terms? Premillennials, post-millennials, amillennials. If you're a good Baptist, you're a premillennial. If you're a good Church of Christ person, you're an amillennialist. And if you're Randy Mayu, you're an I don't care which millennial. I can tell you a story about that. So anyway, the idea was that there's going to be this golden age, 1,000 years of peace, the millennium. And so that's the idea. And that was very much part of what shaped the United States. The next myth is the myth of the Christian nation. The claim that America is a Christian nation consistently guided by Christian values. And so if you want to go ahead and put a star beside this one, and this is what this book says. What a bunch of hogwash. How could this nation have claimed to have been Christian and treated black people the way it did? That's what this book says. And then last of all, the myth of the innocent nation. And he's got an entire book that is a great book that you would understand better if you had Church of Christ background. It's called The Illusion of Innocence. And it's a terrific book. And what it says is the Church of Christ claims that churches abandoned the ways of God, and we have restored the church to what God intended. We have gone back to the innocent beginning. And he called the book The Illusion of Innocence. That's an illusion. And so that's a very good book, but you sort of have to have that kind of background. And so the myth of the innocent nation, the conviction that while other nations may have blood on their hands, the nobility of the American cause always redeems the nation and renders it innocent. It's kind of saying, if there is a God, and if God wanted a nation, then America is what God would have wanted. It's the innocent, God-loving, God-fearing nation. So now, notice the next section. The overarching myth. The myth of white supremacy. So he tells the story near the beginning of a book of giving a lecture on these 5 myths. And an African-American scholar kind of patted his knee afterwards and said, that was very good, but he said, you left out the most significant myth. And Richard Hughes said, really? What? And he said, the myth of white supremacy. And Hughes wrote in the book, he said, my first reaction was, no, that's not the big myth. This man was saying, that's the big myth. But he thought about it, and he read about it, and he studied it as a good historian, and he concluded, yep, that's the big kahuna. That's the big myth. So I'm now back reading from the sheet. The fundamental argument of this book, I like it when an author tells you that. The fundamental argument of this book is twofold. First, that the myth of white supremacy is the primal American myth that informs all the others. And second, that one of the chief functions of the other 5 myths is to protect and obscure the myth of white supremacy, to hide it from our awareness, and to assure us that we remain innocent after all. Now, if you read through this book, you will discover that the champions of equality were white supremacy. And so I've got one little paragraph here from the book. Many of the founders, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, owned slaves. And Jefferson, the man who penned the Declaration's immortal words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, also believed that, and these are his words, Jefferson's words, that blacks were inferior to whites in the endowments both of body and mind. And Lincoln and many, many other heroes of equality believed in white supremacy. Abraham Lincoln basically said, white people are superior to black people, we just shouldn't use that as an excuse to keep them as slaves. That's basically what Lincoln said. Now, you already know my discomfort in presenting this book. I'm a white guy. And Richard Hughes is a white man. And I think I'll read the quote, it's in this list. He says, I have never had anything bad happen to me, Richard Hughes said, because of the color of my skin. He said, I've had other things bad happen to me, but not because of the color of my skin. And I'm in a little bit of fear, so I want to ask forgiveness in advance if I slip. I do not want to use the word white supremacy, because I don't believe it's a good phrase. I want to use the phrase, the myth of white supremacy. So if I slip at some point and say white supremacy, it's an accident, because I believe that it is an evil, and I apologize in advance. Now turn to the front. And we just got a lot of work to do here. We have a lot to read through. What is the point? The myth of white supremacy permeates all of American culture and society, yesterday, today, and will it continue? I left that blank. Isn't it interesting that I'm doing this book the day after Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cory Booker, and who was the actor?
Danny
Glover testified in front of the House yesterday about reparations. And I got to tell you, anybody who says reparations are wrong owes it to the discussion to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' award-winning essay, The Case for Reparations. It's in the Atlantic. It's not a short read. It's a book-length essay, multiple chapters. But it is brilliant. And if you read that and then you study the birth and growth of Hamilton Park in Dallas, you begin to see that the argument for reparations is multi-decade and multifaceted. So that was a good set of timing for this. All right. Why is this book worth our time? Number one, we ignore, deny, refuse to be honest about our history. This book is a pretty big dose of reality. Number two, for many, most, practically all white people, we do not know the African American voices. Circle that. We have not read their books. We have not listened to their speeches. The extent of what we know is Martin Luther King, I have a dream. For many, many white people. This book points us to those voices revealing their needed message. Number three, this book is a sweeping historical treatment of some critical issues. It is founded on solid historical research. In other words, this is a book very much worth paying attention to. Okay, I'm not going to read all of the highlights that I included in this handout. Always I have many more. But notice 1 through 8 is from Robert Bellow, who I think wrote the book The Habits of the Heart. I remember reading Bellow a number of years ago. Very good writer. And then notice number 9 and following, until the next broken line occurs. That's written by an African-American scholar, and I don't know that I'll say his name right, Molefi Kete Asante. And this man and Richard Hughes had a lot of conversation, and Hughes greatly respects him, and Mr. Asante respects Mr. Hughes. All right. I'm going to start with quote number 2, and I'll read a bunch of these. We like to think that we gained our independence because of our own bravery alone, but it was an unlikely outcome had it not been for French assistance. We kind of always forget that we didn't do it totally on our own. You missed my Hubert Locke story.
Sorry.
I got to tell you.
He's a great guy.
All right. Number 3, we even refused to join the League of Nations, the brainchild of our President Woodrow Wilson, and isolationism was a powerful influence on American policy up until Pearl Harbor. Number 4, we called the non-communist world the free world, overlooking the dictatorial nature of many of the regimes we sponsored, and we saw ourselves as the leader of this free world, a far cry from the role that Washington's farewell address had envisioned for us. Number 5, our president, when he wrote this the first time, has said that he doesn't believe in nation building. But can it be that there is no relation between collapsing nations and terrorism? Number 7, John Winthrop saw us as a city on a hill, a light to the nations. We are more than ever a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are truly on us. How are we doing? All right. Then we get to the second foreword of the second edition. That was the first edition by Mr. Asante. As a nation, number 10, as a nation, we are exposed. And those who have held on to the myths that have sustained haughtiness, circle that phrase, sustained haughtiness, are exposed the most. And those people who cannot shake the overarching myth of white supremacy are condemned to reap a whirlwind of historical distress, distortion, and social death. Remember, next quote, Homo sapiens, like us, can be traced by DNA to a single mother in Africa. We all come from the same roots. We all are related. We are blood together, except for Patriots fans. Number 12. If a pantheon of great white authors of this generation writing on race could ever be assembled, I believe that Richard Hughes, the author of this book, would have to be in it. For the most part, the majority of white authors are not simply victimized by the myth of white supremacy. They are sustainers of the myth, wanting to believe that whites are superior to other people. Mr. Hughes is not that. And so that's what he's saying. 13, all societies operate on the basis of myths. That's really wrong. And number 14, many of the working myths of the United States are fully linked to the ideas of racism, patriarchy, and domination. Now, this book is about the myth of white supremacy, but there are acknowledgments that there is gender discrimination and other kinds of discrimination. All right, number 15, put a star beside this, and I want to talk about it a minute. Let me read it first. City and street names, weekdays, planets, stars, even corporations are characteristically central to the built linguistic environment. The common nicknames for schools and hotels in the United States, such as Athenas, Athenium, Athenians, Argonauts, Centaurs, Golden Griffins, Golden Rams, Griffins, Griffons, Phoenix, Tritons, Trojans. I debated reading you his paragraph about Trojans. I decided not to. Spartans and so forth are reflective of the built mimic environment. So let me talk about this a minute. He says, you don't think about it, but when the schools you go to are named a certain thing, when the streets are named a certain thing, that you are subtly reminded the world is filled with these people. I went to Forest Hills School in Jacksonville, Florida, named after a Ku Klux Klan leader in northern Florida. There's been a debate about changing that name. I think they may have finally changed it. You remember the famous photograph? This is the greatest photograph I've ever seen. Barack Obama is bending over, and a little boy in a white dress shirt and a tie, African-American boy, is feeling his hair. And put that with the photograph, if you didn't see it, of the little girl staring at Michelle Obama's official portrait. And what those little black boys and black girls are seeing, that the president and the first lady can be like me. Wow. Okay. Number 16, how to educate readers so that they are comfortable with other memes or myths from other cultures is the challenge of Richard Hughes' audience. That's the end of the second foreword. Everything else is from Hughes' writing himself, and you're going to see that I did nearly every quote dealing with the white supremacy myth, not the other myths. So I wanted us to tackle that one. All right, I'm going to read fast and just get ready to follow along. Number 17. Imagine if Reconstruction had actually honored the citizenship of 4 million free people, provided the education, political autonomy, and economic wherewithal warranted by their and their ancestors' hundreds of years of free labor. Imagine the educational prowess our population might now boast. Number 19. We are democratic. We believe in equality. We believe in opportunity. This is the land of all those things. So therefore, there's a tendency to forget about aspects of our history which don't fit that pattern. And so the line that a professor said to Hughes, number 20, Professor, you left out the most important of all the American myths, and what that might that be? The myth of white supremacy. All right. Number 24. When we speak in this book of white supremacy, we are not speaking, put a star beside this one. We are not speaking about white nationalist groups that proclaim white supremacy from the rooftops. We are speaking instead of ourselves and of the common culture in which we live, a culture suffused with the assumption that in most ways whites are superior to blacks. It's not the overt Ku Klux Klan neo-Nazis. As I said maybe a couple of months ago, you realize that half the bus watched Rosa Parks get arrested. They were white, and they did nothing. They did nothing. All right, number 25. My worldview, shaped by this internalized sense of racial superiority, meant that I saw history, morality, the will of God, and scientific truth as the special province of white people, usually white men. Dangerous comment here. The pollsters have asked Democrats, who do you want to be the nominee? 20% of Democrats told the pollsters, this was last week, 20% of Democrats told the pollsters, I don't believe I could vote for a woman. Okay. Number 28 was an old line that was probably spoken in many places. It's a quote from an African American. He said, this is the way it was. If you're white, you're right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. Number 30. W.E.B. Du Bois. One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. All right? Turn to number 34 on page 3. What should we make of the fact that most blacks perceive the myth of white supremacy with startling clarity and view it as pervasive in American life, while most white Americans imagine that white supremacy is confined to the radical fringes of American culture? So James Noel was right. That's the professor that talked to him, that the myth of white supremacy is the primal myth in American life and history. And that to tell this story in any other way would be to speak untruth. All right, number 39 is Lincoln's white supremacy quote. There's a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be in the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Those are the words of Abraham Lincoln, written and saved for posterity. Number 40, Andrew Johnson wrote to Missouri Governor Thomas C. Fletcher that, quote, this is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men. Now, I don't have time to tell you all of the accounts in the book about the Supreme Court decisions that were separate but equal, that were certainly not equal. And we could talk about the 3/5 of a human being, and we could talk about the horrible slaughter of African Americans in Oklahoma and the lynchings. I may have time to read that one. All right. 42. So Reconstruction comes along and things are better. But Reconstruction only intensified the determination of Southern whites to keep the formerly enslaved people in their place, which for many whites meant utter subservience and abject poverty. Slaves in everything but name, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it. Tomorrow I'm doing a synopsis of the book Evicted, which won the Pulitzer. I did it in this room, and I'm doing it at the Downtown Dallas Library for the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance. And I re-looked at the statistics. Pretty simple. White people in Dallas County are doing fine. Black people in Dallas County and many Hispanic people, the poverty level has gotten. So that's the reality. Okay? Number 43, Obama suffered during his first year in office a 400% increase in death threats compared to George W. Bush. Number 45, what we witness in all these episodes is a common pattern in American life. This is really a profound statement. Follow along here. Every time blacks have made notable gains, white rage recurs in American history. For every action of African American advancement, there's a reaction, a backlash. The trigger is always black advancement. It is blackness with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, and with demands for full and equal citizenship. White rage doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, or take to the streets. Working the halls of power, it can achieve its ends far more effectively and far more destructively. Number 46, systemic racism is far from eradicated. Prejudice against blacks still runs deep in American life, and whites in this country have resisted, and often successfully resisted, every major gain that blacks have made over the course of American history. I'm almost out of time. Turn to page 5 and look at quote number 61. This is quite a paragraph. In his 1895 book, Why is the Negro Lynched?, the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass asked how the nation could solve its racial dilemma. It cannot be solved by keeping the Negro poor, degraded, ignorant, and half-starved. It cannot be solved by keeping back the wages of the laborer by fraud. It cannot be done by ballot box stuffing, by falsifying election returns, or by confusing the Negro voter by cunning devices. It cannot be done by repealing all federal laws enacted to secure honest elections. How then could it be done? Let the white people of the North and South conquer their prejudices. Let them give up the idea that they can be free while making the Negro a slave. Let the nation try justice, and the problem will be solved. That's terrific. So, look at number 65 to think about the exhaustion of a lifetime spent trying to change things. By 1961, when W.E.B. Du Bois was 93 years old, he was thoroughly discouraged over America's failure to implement the promise of the American Creed for African Americans. He therefore joined the American Communist Party and moved to Ghana. Okay, turn to page 6. I did present in this room the new Jim Crow, which is kind of the big book of the last 2 or 3 years by Michelle Alexander, number 76. Michelle Alexander has described the backlash against the freedom movement of the 1960s as the new Jim Crow, an effort to incarcerate black people through a massive war on drugs launched by Reagan's administration in 1982. The most important phrase in Alexander's last question is this: denied access to the mainstream economy. The new Jim Crow, coupled with the vast and privatized prison industrial complex, has served and continues to serve to lock young blacks out of America's capitalist system. Michelle Alexander confessed that she came quite reluctantly to the conclusion she presented in her book. 10 years ago, she writes, I would have argued strenuously against the central claim here, namely, that something akin to a racial caste system currently exists in the United States. I strongly encourage you to read the rest of the highlighted passage. Now turn to page 8, and I've got 5 lessons and takeaways. Number 1, let's start here. A white person cannot know what it is to be black in America. I can't know it. And no white person can. Number 2, let's start here. The mistreatment of black people in this country, based on the view of black people that flows from the myth of white supremacy, has been horrific, systemically, from then to now. Number 3, one thing we all could do would be to read more of the African American voices. Read their words in their books and their speeches and their writings. And so, if you're going to discuss reparations, invest a pretty big chunk of time and read The Case for Reparation. Number 4, to use a very religious word, repentance might be a pretty good thing right now. And number 5, we really do need to address the policy decisions that perpetuate the myth of white supremacy. Policy can be and is many times racist. So that's the book. Myths America Lives By, White Supremacy and the Stories That Give Us Meaning. And I will tell you that if you were to read this book and come away saying, hey, every black person has as much opportunity as a white person, you were not opening your mind when you read it. Hope you found this useful. Thank you very much.